Hello, Karen. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Good. Hello, Lorenz. And thank you so much for having me. This is an exciting platform to be on and great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what emerges. And I'd love to start by asking you, what does transformation mean to you?
Transformation is for me, I'd say that firstly, I'd say that it's an inside out process. Um, I look into the world and see transformation is needed, but I look into myself and know that I can't produce what I yearn for if I don't start to consider who I need to be for that to happen. So transformation is starts with a way of being, not what we do. And that is more compassion needed in the world for sure. Then how do I go to work on that? There's
Mm,
more aspects of courage and selflessness and the qualities that I call the deep feminine often. That's where I need to go to work because I know that I've been conditioned in particular ways, and to recognize my conditioning and be able to access that wisdom or that self awareness, and then start to develop the qualities that I see as the best version of our humanity. That's what transformation is for me, is developing the qualities that are the best version of ourselves.
mm. I know that a lot of your work centers around what you call feminine intelligence. What would you say is the intersection of feminine intelligence and transformation?
I would say that um, feminine intelligence is needed for transformation. And through my research and 7 years of doing and working as a founder of FemQ, but 35 years of working in personal development and leadership development, I would say that what I've seen in every system I've worked in, every organization I facilitated conversations and workshops in, the feminine is missing.
Mm,
And therefore, for systemic change and transformation, I think we need to include feminine qualities, which are the softer side of our humanity, which have been discarded or discriminated and marginalized against because they haven't seen as an operating system inside our humanity that delivers results. And I think because we've been orientated to performance results, which are still critical, but they negate compassion, selflessness, intuition, and some of the aspects that we have traditionally called feminine. And I think also, if I'm looking out into nature as I speak to you, and I think our disconnect from nature and our natural world has also contributed to this disconnect from the feminine, because Mother Nature works in rhythms and cycles, as do women, but also the qualities of the feminine can be acquired and developed in any person. It's not
mm,
gendered, which is why we call it feminine, not female, and distinguish between the two. So I think that's a huge, very, very strong connection for me in terms of the transformation that's needed and really being yearned for
mm,
is men to be able to hold the feminine energy in themselves with deep respect and regard when they've been told and received many messages, just as women have, that the feminine qualities are soft and weak versus powerful and important.
mm. One of the things that, well, I feel I attribute to masculine qualities is this desire to measure everything. And, FemQ kind of being a reference to IQ, which is obviously a system of measuring intelligence. Is there a way to measure these feminine qualities?
I think, Lorenz, that's probably the toughest thing of all is measuring the invisible,
Mm,
um, and measuring transformation. And I was speaking with a colleague in Berlin last week who's a scientist and a researcher in this realm of, she's been working on measuring self compassion and transformation for decades. And um, one of the things that she explained to me that as a researcher, she has, I think she said, at least 40 points of reference to measure transformation. And that's incredible, the research she's done and what that's taken her. And she measures it through hormones, she measures it through um, our ability to have self compassion and many, many other qualities and distinctions that she uses. But she's developed that over 20 years. And I think the challenge for us, Lorenz, is being able to measure something that's intangible because we're so used to measuring and quantifying the tangible. And I think that in and of itself is the transformation that we need, is to now look for evaluation and measurement through this lens of how do we measure compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say my experience of working with the Hunger Project back in the 90s, when I would go to India and Bangladesh, and the question was, how do we measure the end of hunger? And that doesn't mean food on someone's table, because the chronic persistence of hunger is a societal norm that gets perpetuated in villages all over India, in communities. But how we learned to measure it was that women are at the decision making table. Now, why that would end hunger is that when women are at the table and there is an inclusive conversation and there is equality and deep respect and dignifying the feminine, the community flourishes. So, how do we measure that? We have to have and design new evaluation systems and protocols, because at the moment in corporates, what I see is that the measurement of diversity, equality, and inclusion, this famous DEI acronym, is often just saying we've met the quota. We have 4 women at the table and 4 men, so we have equality. Well, that's not the same thing as transforming the condition and the mindset of the people at the table. So we might very well have diversity of marginalized voices, different races, genders, generations, and so forth. But it doesn't mean we've had a shift in that mindset and shift in consciousness. And that's the tough part to measure. So what we can see is, if you like, being able to detect in a culture where there's a shift, where we see actively people being compassionate, actively people taking care of one another and exhibiting kindness and fairness. And one of my colleagues who works in climate change, who was at the FemQ Summit recently, said she has noticed that instead of talking about justice, she talks about fairness. Because justice, for example, she has seen is more masculine because it denotes in the word that we either have to have retribution, retaliation, or rectification of some sort of measurement, whereas fairness really can't be measured. So fairness is a quality that we inhabit. And that's why this conversation has always been a big challenge for me, and I'm willing to take on the challenge because it's so needed. But I'm often speaking to evaluators of how do we measure the intangible? How do we measure human qualities being exhibited in a culture? Now, we often see it in crisis when people are facing devastation in their communities, or we see it in where people are helping one another. But I want to offer and suggest and understand for that we exhibit these qualities not when there's crisis, but we exhibit these qualities to create and shape the future that we all yearn for, a flourishing future.
How did this become like a thing for you? Like, when did you begin to crystallize this idea of feminine intelligence? Because I know you've been working in different impact projects for your whole life. And so at some point, something emerged where you kind of collected this understanding of what you're calling feminine intelligence. And I'm curious how that crystallized.
I think the catalyst for me, Lorenz, would have been when I didn't finish high school. So when I left high school, I didn't even finish my final year because my father had such a big influence on me that he said I didn't need a university degree, that I should go into sales like he did. So I left school with the notion that I was being guided, shaped, or influenced strongly by my father's um, way that he thought I should earn a living or move forward. But what struck me is I started studying Rudolf Steiner's work. Anthroposophy was my spiritual background. And as I delved more into what's the meaning of my life, who am I, and my spiritual studies, I went into the area of healing. So I became a therapist and a healer, and I built, because I was so enamored and passionate about the healing powers of essential oils, I created a business and started bottling essential oils at the kitchen tabletop. So what I saw was the feminine in me that wanted to bring healing, that wanted to care for others, and wanted, as I discovered what the oils did for me, I had a mission in my company to return healing to the healers, which my sister and I said were the women. So as I worked with thousands of women over 13 years, I owned that company and built that company. I started to see what happened when women had agency and they took the power of their agency out of the hands of medical practitioners that were telling them, advising them about their bodies, and took it back into their own hands and followed their intuition. So I think that was a really strong catalyst for me, is being a healer, seeing what women, when they nourished their bodies and their nourished their bodies with essential oils every day, the transformation that happened inside of them. I think the other point of reference would be after the company was sold and I moved to England, I started working, instead of oils out of plants, I started working with companies that took oils out of the ground. So I worked in the toughest industries of them all, which is the extractive industries in mining and oil and gas. So I had this one world of working with all women, and then the next part of my career was with all men. And I could see these contrasts of what happened when women were part of an intrinsic part of the system, and also my work in India and Bangladesh when they were included, and then when it was male dominated, the conversations were vastly different. And there were very few women at the table in those meetings I would have, and how I was even regarded when I walked into the room. So I think that they're very powerful catalysts for me. And when I would have personal coaching sessions with these executives, they would say how they often felt like they had one hand tied behind their back because their compassion, their sense of work-life balance, their priority of their family versus performance and working 80 hours a week, that was burning them out. So I could see that the feminine missing was causing and devastating people's lives and causing havoc. So I think for me, all the way along, I've had these messages of what if the feminine were included? What if the feminine were restored in our psyche and for all of us? And instead of being discarded, that we started using the creative side, of the relational side of our brain versus the logical and rational side, which narrows our perspective, even in that's how we're educated. So I think every system that I looked at, whether it was medicine, the arts, politics, every single system I could see had been designed by men, pretty much for men. And that's a devastation to the quality and potential of one, the feminine, and two, women.
Mm.
So I think all of these epiphanal moments, including going through my own transformation and healing my own broken heart over many instances, were all for me highlights. And I guess existential moments where I said, what's the meaning of life now? Who do I need to be now? Who would I be if I wasn't me now? So I'm always asking myself those deep, deep questions.
Mm. And I want to maybe invite you to expand on this distinction, because the distinction between being a woman and the feminine, because you also, in your example, you talked about you were primarily working with women and then you were primarily working with men. But then you're also drawing this distinction of these feminine qualities that are also available to men. Then I've also heard you talk about the nature of female anatomy. So I'd love to just open up the territory there. What is it there that is available to a man exactly?
um, how I'd like to answer the question, Lorenz, is what catalyzed me into this inquiry of this distinction you're making of the difference. So I can remember being in so many conversations where people challenge me about what is feminine intelligence and how do I measure it, all the questions we're delving into
Mm.
today. But there was one particular instance where I was actually living in Costa Rica for 2 years over the time of the pandemic. And a man said, he was asking me about FemQ, and he said, I'm really in touch with my feminine. And I said, how so? I'm really curious. What does that mean to you? He said, I'm very empathetic. I can feel the emotions of others. And I said, oh, it's a beautiful quality and one that's really important in leadership, that we can actually attune to others. We resonate, we can understand, we feel. And he said, yes. And he continued saying how feminine he was. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I don't really sense that as I'm thinking to myself. And then I said, well, I think there's something else at work here. And he said, what's that? Now, I didn't even know where this was going to come from. But the words that came out of my mouth is I said, I can really see the feminine qualities you're speaking about that you embody. And there's something else. He said, what's that? And I said, a woman's biology. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, we both look at the moon. We see it waxing and waning, and often when many of us are sitting under the full moon in awe of the majesty and the mystery. And he said, yeah, for sure. And so he was agreeing with me to that point. And then I said, however, for 30 years, my body operated in a cycle with the moon called menstruation. I'm going through that cycle every month. The bleeding of women is what, without that, we wouldn't be able to bring life to life. And Rupert Sheldrake, as a scientist, speaks about that every organ has an intelligence. And I said to him, wouldn't you call that an intelligence of my body? Not better than, but, and different to yours. So there is an intelligence that women have in their biology, that hosting a fetus, bringing life to life, as we need men and women. However, the woman is hosting that little being in her belly, in her womb for those 9 months. He said, yeah, I got it. Now, the minute he said I got it, I went, okay, that's one point of agreement. Let me go further with that. So I started investigating it. So it's all these tiny little moments. I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, let me research. Okay, let me go into that. So I started researching what happens in a woman's body through menstrual cycles, through the fetal exchange of when she's hosting a child, when she's fallen pregnant, everything that happens, how our neurological and nervous system is formulated in the mother's womb, and how trauma that the mother goes through is actually taken up in the nervous system of the fetus. And I started realizing that the biology is critical. The biological intelligence of a woman's body is a critical intelligence. And so, the menstrual cycle and our periods are not in the public domain of conversation. And yet, and you heard me say this at the summit, Lorenz, we more easily talk about the blood of war than we talk about the blood of a menstrual cycle, because one's very public and one's very private. That all of these things are incredibly important. And then when I look further, things like endometriosis and women's conditions that they deal with were not even researched in medicine until the 70s or 80s, because medicine was so orientated around a man's biology. So I think we haven't really done the research, and I'm determined to keep bringing it through, of the difference between the biology and the intelligence of the system and the qualities of the feminine that we can all foster and generate and embody.
Mm-hmm. And the qualities being what you talked about earlier, like how would you maybe expand on that a little bit, the compassion, the intuition?
Yes. Well, Lorenz, also I do something called the 12 virtues of soulful leadership. And in fact, what I would say about those 12 virtues, I think they are very feminine, all of the 12. So, for example, the one that I always start with is devotion. Now, devotion in terms of a religious context, people shy away from that word, but devotion is very, very powerful energy that transforms people into and mobilizes people into action. So when we really get in touch with what matters most to us, what we care mostly about, devotion is a very, very powerful virtue, because for me, devotion is the mother bear coming out of hibernation and going into the wild and then protecting her cubs. It's like a fierce energy that protects. If it's distorted and overplayed, it becomes violent. It can become violent. So we have to watch for these qualities, because not we talk about toxic masculinity in corporates a lot, but there's also toxic femininity. And the toxic or the shadow side of the feminine can be betrayal. There's many of the shadow sides of the feminine as well as the masculine. But I would say the qualities of the feminine are devotion, selflessness, that if they're overplayed, then selflessness becomes martyrdom. So we have to be mindful that there's always the balance of these qualities as well. The others would be deep listening, intuition, and I'm even moving from talking about gut instinct with a lot to which, we know that there's so millions of neurons in the gut that feed our brain and give us information. But I've just come from a retreat where I spent the first couple of weeks of the new year in detoxifying myself, because I started thinking, if my gut's in a mess, how do I possibly get in touch with my gut instinct? So I wanted to clean out the system so I'm really clear and clean and can make decisions from a place of discernment and what matters to me. So I think that's often what we lose in our high performing in corporates, measuring KPIs. I don't know one organization that has compassion as a KPI, as a key performance indicator. So I think that's, for me, some of these qualities that magnanimity is another one of the virtues. And that means for me a magnitude of goodness. Not a lot of people can even pronounce that word. And that's what I love about it. It's not a can you pronounce it, but can you bring it? So I think these qualities are so critical right now in the transformation we need on the planet, in our world, in our corporate environments. People want to feel a sense of belonging, connection, that they're cared for, that they're valued, that they can be seen for all of who they are. So I think these are the qualities of leadership that harness the potential, creativity, and possibility of the human spirit.
How do you think about cultivating these qualities, like in the context of like something that someone might learn?
I think it's in every single executive program that I've ever led, people will say to me, yes, I need to be a good listener. And my question is often, how's that going? How are you practicing that? And I can remember one very high level executive that he said, yes, everyone tells me I need to be a good listener. And I said, so how do you practice? He said, I keep trying. And that's when I said, how's that going? And I gave him an exercise to go home and sit with his 13-year-old son every night, because his son loves reading, and ask his son to read him, the father, a chapter of his favorite book. And the executive who I was speaking to said, okay. And I said, why do you think I'm giving you that practice? And he said, well, I have to listen. And I said, yes, but also your emotions are engaged. You love your son. So there's something at work here that has you invested in the practice that is more than about performance or being a good leader. It's about wanting to reconnect and have a relationship with your son. Are you really interested in having a relationship with your employees? Otherwise, the practice becomes superficial versus a transformation that happens in the spirit of, I see the relationship I'm building and that's meaningful to me. So I think the practices can sometimes be obscure. And I say, for example, to leaders who are wanting to develop agility in their mind and in their way of operating, I say, go home and watch videos on Michael Jackson and practice the dance, practice moving somatically your body so that you're embodying agility. It's not in your head. And I think that's the transformation, Lorenz, of How do we practice these things? How do we practice balance? And people say to me, we need more work-life balance. That's not a diary exercise. I'll schedule boundaries in my day. Go into nature and walk across a log and see how you balance on the log. It's a dynamic, energetic state. That's balance. You know when you're out of balance, but we don't correct. We just keep pushing through for performance.
Mm.
And so I think these practices are incredibly important, that they become somatic. They become deeply embedded in our body and change our nervous system.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people attempt to practice these qualities through the mind versus the body and the emotions and the heart.
Mm. So those examples you gave me there, they feel like something you might prescribe in like a one-on-one coaching context. Like how might you approach this in a group context in terms of somehow cultivating these qualities?
Well, in fact, the story I told you about the executive that said about being a good listener was with
Mm.
his whole team, the
Mm.
executive
Mm.
team. So I
Mhm.
was running a workshop, a 2-day workshop for an executive team, and there were 10 of them in the room. So we actually went round and said, which is the quality that you would like to cultivate? And I'd actually created a deck of cards, 51 cards in the pack that attributed to the masculine and feminine qualities. And I worked with a psychologist to work with these qualities. And I showed them the 51 cards and said, which of these qualities are you that you have a strength in, and how would you counterbalance it? And so it was a mini workshop within these 2 days. And for example, assertiveness was a quality that many of them said, which is we need. And how would you, or honesty was actually one that was in particular. I say what I think, I'm direct. And I said, okay, but often the word honesty can be attributed to, and people call it brutal honesty.
Mm.
And they said, yeah, for sure, I've heard that term. So if honesty is a quality and you would like to counterbalance that with another quality, what would the one be that you'd bring in? And we had this conversation between 10 of us. So we were talking about these qualities and what would be the counterbalance to the strength. Because when a strength is overplayed, it becomes a weakness, like honesty. When one is too honest, we we can often find that people are just sharing their opinions to us versus having an authentic conversation. So they all said the counterbalance would be compassion or empathy, being able to stand in someone else's shoes before I open my mouth and say what I say, understand what the person is dealing with before I just go for it and give them feedback. You're not doing, example, in a performance review, understand what's going on in someone's life. Why has their performance dropped? What's going on in their lives? Are they going through a difficult time at home, especially since the pandemic, Lorraine? The statistics are horrendous with mental health, as we know. So very much, I always work in groups because the one person will hear something about someone else that they feel relates to themselves. So a forum for these conversations is critical, and that's how an executive team or a group changes or transforms, is learning and seeing and respecting the nuances of the team and the diversity of the team.
Mm. Mm. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that you do with FAMQ is also just that it's um, operating at a with this aspiration for a global context, and I'm curious, like beyond an individual team, you have this really powerful message around um, the power of feminine intelligence. How do you think about um, what it takes to scale that to a global level?
I really do see, and thanks for bringing that in, Lorenz. I really do see that our aspiration or our commitment is a global shift in consciousness. And that would produce a systemic change and a transformation. And how I see that going is my commitment and aim or aspiration is to create an app where we can identify around the world on the ground practitioners or in organization the leaders that are shifting the paradigm of leadership and impacting community from the grassroots level up. So I see that the more that we can get, as you know, at the summit, you and Natasha were there, we had many activists and social entrepreneurs at the summit, and they are the ones producing the impact in community at local level. And I think we have to do both. We have to work from grassroots up. And my aspiration this year, and especially because our intention is to go to Brazil and also back to Strasbourg this year, is to bring together the activists, the social entrepreneurs, and the corporate leaders so that they're learning from one another.
Mm.
And I think in that collaboration and connection, we start to transform the system, because while corporates do what they do and the social entrepreneurs do what they do, there is not the cohesion that we need for the whole system to change. And so where do we find the doctors in medicine that actually have come to see that there is more than surgery or drugs to heal, that they are using these contemplative practices and spiritual practices as a way of healing and healing the body. And so where do we bring these two together, the world of spirit and science and the world of corporate and social entrepreneurs and activism? I think this is the bridge I want to create.
Mm. What are like some of the resources that you can provide these people to then bring out into their own world, to bring this quality of feminine intelligence into the world that they do, into the work that they do?
There's a program that we're launching this year called Catalyzing Transformation. Um, because my own experience from all these years of working in these different areas is that we can't do transformation. I don't know what that even means. But what we can do is shift ourselves and our way of being and catalyze transformation by the actions we take. So catalysts are very powerful influencers. And I think that this program and these many people are doing so many, like the platform that you're providing. This is so important because we've got so many different perspectives of who you're bringing in, Lorenz, to this conversation. So there's not one approach, that's for sure. These are all fractals of the whole. It's like a diamond with all the different facets to it. And I think FemQ is one of them, where I'm not saying we have the answer to something. We have an answer to one of the things and a component that's missing in the system. So I think catalyzing transformation and training people in these virtues of the feminine, these principles of the feminine, and how to work in a much more holistic, integrative way is critical in corporates. And this year, it is a big focus for us on corporates and entrepreneurs who are, one, starting up businesses. Like I started my aromatherapy company very much based on feminine principles. I wouldn't have called it that then, but I knew no different because I didn't have a business degree. I didn't know how to do a business plan or a strategy, or I just went with my gut and said, healing is needed. Women need to be healed and restored their agency and empowered. And that I could see that in the system. So I think being a healer has me look at the system. And I think that's important, is that people start to look from the system, what's going on in the system, that if I provided something, everything would shift. And we can all ask that question. What can I bring that if I showed up and brought that thing, think everything would change? And I think that's who leaders are. Leaders who say, I say, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, Mahatma Gandhi, Jacinda Ardern. I mean, there are so many leaders we can speak of. Joan Holmes in the Hunger Project, who I worked with, was one of those leaders. I say the end of hunger in my lifetime. Now, did she do it? No. And she passed the baton on. So we may not see it happen in our lifetime, but I think it is critical that we start standing for leading from what matters most to our planet and to our children and our grandchildren, what matters to our humanity and our natural world.
Mm. How do you help people recognize that?
It doesn't, I don't think it takes very much means,
Mm.
quite honestly. I think a lot of people, when I speak, especially to women about feminine intelligence and say that it's missing in the system, I just need to say that. And
Mm.
mostly I've got agreement.
No, but I mean the
And
part about like what matters most to them to really help them have a direct experience with it.
oh, so in terms of what matters most, there's a couple of different approaches. I worked with Joanna Macy or trained in Joanna Macy's work back in 2001 with Joanna in California. Many people I know who work in system change and transformation know of Joanna's work. And one of the things that Joanna would say is what breaks your heart and do something about that. I've shifted that because there's too much heartbreak for me in the world right now. Everybody's got a broken heart and people are paralyzed by too much. So I now talk about take some space, sit in a quiet place, a sacred space where you can have silence and tap into what matters most. If you had your basic needs taken care of, which I think pretty much anyone that would be on this platform, we have a roof over our head, we have resources, we have food. If we have those basic needs met, what matters most to me in the world? What difference can I make? Why am I here at this time? So I provoke it through many different questions, but they're existential questions that have gone on, philosophers gave us many centuries ago. What matters most to me? Why am I here? And what can I bring that would make a difference? And I think just starting with that deep question, what matters most to me in the world? Why am I here at this time? I believe we are all here at this incredible time in history to bring everything we've got to make the biggest difference.
Mm.
So I think it's always, for me, I love that we have online platforms and you and Natasha do such an extraordinary job of bringing this about thousands, if not millions, as you proceed. And for me, the in-person, which is why I keep doing the summits, the in-person events, as you experience, many people said they felt safe, they felt loved, they felt in community, and that experience embedded in the somatic system of our nervous system and our bodies. Everybody went out into the world feeling stronger and more resilient. So I think these in-person retreats are still essential
Hmm.
to look into one another other's eyes, feel each other's heart connection, feel you and I both know we do energy work over on these on our online platforms, and I'm such a big fan of Sutra and do my work on Sutra, and the in person for me is incredibly important. And I'm doing a retreat in 42 acres here in England, which is a phenomenal regeneration uh, location where they focus on vegetarian food and regenerating the land and reforesting. And the program's called Leading with Grace and Resilience. And those words are incredibly important to me. Grace is the mystery, is the unknown, is the when we look into the universe, like how do we make sense of that, tapping into those higher intelligences and building our capacity to be resilient in the face of uncertainty and chaos.
Mm. Can you expand on that program a little bit, the structure of that program, Leading with Grace and Resilience? Like what is the structure of the program and how is it delivering on those virtues?
It is in particular, this particular one is for women and those who identify as women. And what I would say, the structure is over 5 days. So we come in on Sunday and we start to look at, firstly, our intention, what matters most, and why is everyone here. But the days unfold into an understanding of how we were shaped. How do we get where we are? We look at the history of the Industrial Revolution and how we treat human beings like resources. So it's very much a leadership program. And how do we shift this relationship to objectifying and separating into object and transaction instead of relation. So instead of being transactional, how do we become so transactional and separate from one another, and start to reconnect to nature and start to reconnect to the nature of the true nature of ourselves. And then we look at how, if that's the shaping that we've had, and we didn't choose it. We got influenced by our parenting, our whether it was religion, peer groups, our culture. Being Australian, I have Australian culture inside of me. And for a long time, I resisted it and fought against it. And now I accept it. But there's been a lot of healing that I had to do. So part of the work is healing what was taken from us or what was damaged or the trauma that we went through. So we do these somatic exercises. We learn how our bodies respond when we walk into a room to what we're experiencing, and then we shut down or we expand. So we learned these powerful exercises through somatic and embodied leadership of how to correct and heal the nervous system for what has happened and shut us down. And then as the days go on, by the final day, we are actually moving into going forward, which is what will we bring now as we go back into the corporate environment, which is so on our own is very difficult to transform. Who do we have as our partners and our influencers and the others in the organization that we can start to cohere with to shape the future of the organization and the culture? So it's a transition from me to we to the community to the organization. So we're moving through starting with self into the next step is how do we lead others? But also because I've built a multi-million-dollar business based on feminine principle, and I've coached for decades now and worked as an advisor to business, I feel like I've got an as-lived experience of what that takes. I didn't learn something in a university. I've actually developed it in my being and in my, as I call it, an as-lived experience. And that's really what the 5 days is an as-lived experience of transformation.
And I'd love to just dig into a little more detail on some of these parts here. So you talked about, for example, in the beginning, looking at what brought us here. Is that a conversational process? Is that you offering a short lecture and then inviting conversation? Like what is how do you get people to connect around that topic?
I introduce certain aspects that have influenced us in the wider world, like in the Industrial Revolution. In particular, we can refer that back into recent history and how do we become human resources. So people start to look at how they became functional in an organization by providing something that the organization needed to be profitable. So there's a starting point of what most people can identify with. And then we dig deeper into, okay, so if that's a global phenomena, now let's look at culture. Where were you born? What was the geography you were born into? What was the cultural impulse or impression or information you received that told you this is how to be?
Is
So
that
in
a
Australia,
is that a journaling process?
firstly it's a conversation, so people share, and that conversational piece prompts others to think about themselves.
Mm.
And in a forum where there's the collective sharing, often I might not be able to get to what matters to me or how I was shaped. But if I hear from someone else, oh, I remember a time or in my environment, I was told children should be seen and not heard. And then someone else says, yeah, that happened to me. So it's a
Mm.
prompt and a catalyst for an opening up and developing of a greater self-awareness of actually what happened. And then it's a journaling, and we send everybody off into the woods and into the trees, and you sit by the lake. And now look more deeply. Here's the next level. Now look more deeply. What was the personal experience of what you got told? So in Australia, my growing up and my experience of growing up in that at that time was very orientated to very my recollection, my experience was it was very chauvinistic, if not even misogynistic in many instances. Um, and so I learned to behave in a particular way. And I saw my options in school as a secretary or a typist that shaped me until I got out into the world, and then something else started to shape me. And then I stepped into healing. So these journeys and transitions we go through are incredibly important. I've
Mm.
even been saying, actually, Lorenzo, was with a group of 6 women when I was in this retreat, a dear friend of both of ours, actually, Judith, brought in a group of 6 women. And one woman said that she'd moved out of international relations and into being a yoga teacher. And I said, I know this is happening world over, yoga teachers and coaches, because a lot of women can't take the corporate environment or don't want to keep adapting to that environment. And I said, what if you could bring the feminine into international relations? And she said, how would I do that? And I said, you could use your incredible skill and training and bring the feminine qualities in that would shape how international relations are done. Wouldn't that be amazing? Everything you've learned in yoga, bring it back into international relations. So I think it's in the program, we're looking at what shaped us and then what had us make another choice. But how, if we could bring the feminine and own it and bring all of those qualities into the system, that would make a difference. So we look at the system, how it shaped us, the culture, how it shaped us, and how we can shape ourselves into not adapting, but being catalysts for transformation.
Mm. I love how that creates the direct experience for people. So it's not just something that you give them, it's something that they discover and realize and also discover through the sharing of each other. How do you think about, like when you're designing a process like that, how do you think about the questions that you pick? And do you have a process for selecting questions? Is it just something that you feel? Do you have a set of questions you come back to over and over?
There are some that I come back to over and over. One that's really been incredibly important to me, Lorenz, and I'm sure I've shared this with you, is during the pandemic when I'd lost all my corporate clients because of the uh, isolation. I woke up one morning and didn't know what to do with myself. Really, it was like, well, now what? And then I paused for a moment. And after my meditation, I just asked the question out loud in sitting up in bed and asked the question, if you like, to the universe, what's needed? Who do I need to be and what do I need to do? So there were two things. The question that I always ask people is, who would I be if I wasn't me? And
What
every
does that
time
mean
I say,
exactly?
so who would I be if I wasn't me? Shaped by told to be a particular way by my father,
Got it.
shaped by the Australian culture and the influences and negative messaging I got most of the time, until I created my own business and really shaped my future and said, I'm doing aromatherapy, even though it had never been heard of. I'm taking aromatherapy into hospitals where it's so sorely needed. So I became very bold about what I stood for and who I wanted to be. So I think it's, who would I be if I wasn't me in the pandemic, was who would I be if I wasn't me needed more work. Not who would I be if I wasn't me, like I'd be the Dalai Lama. No. Who would I be if I wasn't me in the shaping of me?
Mm.
And I even, and I'm still really seriously considering it, changing my name because I didn't choose my name. So I'm Karen, but I'm actually the name I love is Karina. I'm thinking, oh, I should do that on Facebook. No, then nobody would know me. And so that's the challenge. Who would I be if I wasn't me?
Mm.
Challenges people to go beyond their comfort zone because it messes with people's relationships.
Mhm.
And you and I both know, when we've both done, all of us have done so much work in our own lives of transformation. We go out into the world after we've done a workshop and people go, oh, you've just done a workshop. Yeah, we'll wait till you get back to who you were. No. Now now this is my future. Now I'm stepping into, this is who I am. So I think that is one that I'm always asking people, ask yourself, who would I be if I wasn't me?
Mm.
And then the next one is, if I had all of my needs met, my basic needs met, and I could do what really mattered and understood why I'm here at this time, let's delve into that one. Because we are here to serve, we are here to generate, we are here to optimize our potential, not to play small, not to diminish. We are here to optimize everything we have at this time, the best of ourselves. And that's what does the best of yourself look like? And then how do we cultivate those qualities? And that's these 5 days. And women leave, you know, one of our colleagues that you and I both know, I won't mention her name, one of our colleagues who participated, dear friend now, who participated in one of the very first Grace and Resilience programs, was in a corporate environment and now is an entrepreneur running her own business with her own messaging, with her own powerful business. And she made that transition out of that program. So I do know it produces extraordinary transformation for women coming into their own and fulfilling their potential.
Mm. I love that point you're making about, you come out of an experience, you have this insight or epiphany, and then there's the integration of it. There's the making it your way of being. And I know I definitely had that experience. I had a life-changing experience in 2011, and I came out of that and I went to my friends and I said, I'm moving to New York and I'm working on world peace. They're like, good luck with that.
Okay.
But it was something that has really become the purpose of my life, to really this inquiry of what does peace mean and how can I be in service of it. And um it's taken every bit of commitment. It's taken my whole being to commit to that, to have the relationship with it that I do. So I one of the things that I appreciated about the summit, the FemQ summit that I was at with you a few months ago, was how in the closing process you took people through this exercise around taking a stand. And I wonder if you can just share a little bit of how that process works, because I thought it was so powerful.
Mm. I think that when I look back, because it's a process I do repetitively everywhere, because standing for something, as you experienced, Lorenz, and as you know, standing for something is not the same as um, having a dream. When you stand for something, everyone knows how to stand with you. Everyone knows where they're standing or where not to stand. So when I stand for the feminine, and having that expressed in every aspect of society, I can lose people in that stand. I can say, people say, oh, I'm not for that. But I'm very clear in making that stand who is with me and who is not. No judgment about who is or who isn't. But as I make my stand, what comes through me is the faith in myself that this matters most to me. This is my life's work. This is what I stand for. And then I need the resilience, which is why I do grace and resilience. The grace is, I think, my stand. The grace comes through me. This is what I stand for. This is who I know myself to be. And not fixing a problem. It's a declarative speech act, which is now and ongoing. Doesn't have a time frame to it. So I can change my stand, but the stand doesn't have an outcome. And then what comes underneath the stand is what here's my stand. This is what I'm committing myself to, and here's what I will do about it. So the stand must come if it's authentic and it's going to be realized as an as lived experience and in the real world. It has to come with commitment and action.
Mm.
And one of the things I will say about often, and you heard me speak about this, is the feminine for me restores integrity to our system. And I don't mean integrity by morality and ethics. I mean integrity as wholeness. So when something's in integrity, it's whole and complete. And right now, our system, globally, systems are out of integrity. And I say by putting the feminine back in, it restores harmony and integrity. So the other aspect to integrity or commitment is doing what you say you will do, even when the feeling in which you said it has left you.
That last part is key, huh?
That's the kicker. Because you and I can have a great conversation over dinner. I'm really committed, and this is what should happen in the world, and it's all wrong, and this is right. And however, by the end of the conversation, if you and I aren't standing for something, and I know who you are and what I can count on you for, that makes all the difference in our partnership. And I know you and I have that. I know what you stand for. You know what I stand for. And we empower each other's stands, you know, bringing something into the world that is unique to each of us. And I think that's why, you know, diversity is critical. It's the uniqueness of someone's stand and commitment. That's diversity.
Mm.
And how that unleashes human potential is incredible. And some of the leaders I've seen in India and Bangladesh of women that showed up in meetings being beaten by their mothers-in-laws because they were leaving the house. But because of their commitment to a vision greater than what they were facing, their commitment to that vision for a future for their children and their community, they got in action, they cohered their actions, and as a group of women, they shaped their community. And that power, as Margaret Mead said, never underestimate what the power of a small group of individuals, because that's what makes the difference. I'm paraphrasing, that's not the exact quote, but the essence and the sentiment is there. And I think that's what you're producing in Sutra with Natasha and your global community. That's what you're producing here in this platform with all of us that you've
Mm.
invited in. And that's what I'm committed to with the summit, which will happen again in, you know, what was amazing, Lorenz, is when we step into our stand, I just want to add this piece, magic happens. I now use the phrase that a friend said to me, oh, you're producing results by mysterious means. I said, exactly. And I love that phrase. I do. I produce results by mysterious means. And out of one conversation last year that I had with Uli, the year before with Uli Albrecht, who owns the chateau where we had the summit, in 1 hour conversation, never having met her before, she said, please come. I went, we designed the time frame and how I would do the summit, how our team and I would do the summit. And now after the summit that happened in October, she said, please consider the chateau your annual home for FemQ. It was so
Mm.
magical and so special. And so now we will host the summit amongst other locations, but we will host it every year in October in France, in Strasbourg.
Mm.
That's
Amazing.
that's you know, how does that happen other than enrollment? She was so touched by what we brought and who everyone was that came to the summit. So I think they're the sorts of things that I call feminine intelligence, because she just went, this has to happen. This is
Mm.
important.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh, I want to touch something that you just said, which is, and I really love this part about taking a stand for something, even when the feeling of, you know, what got you to take that stand maybe has left you. And I guess the other side of that is the discomfort that you might have to deal with in taking your stand. And so there's this, I mean, interesting connotation of the feminine being gentle and soft and maybe I'm so I like the reaction there, but you know maybe the mainstream I don't know, but who knows what the mainstream relationship to that is. But um, this there's this line of standing for something and yet being receptive and yet being willing to be with discomfort and somewhere there's a certain wisdom that that is relevant. I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking here, but um, I think this idea of taking a stand and inevitably the significance of that is that you're willing to stand in the face of discomfort and the role of feminine intelligence in that.
Um, I think in the first instance, when one takes a stand, it's so damn scary because you hear yourself speak those words and you like, really? You know, often another part inside of us goes, really? I just said that? Can I do that? And then all that kicks in, you know, the imposter syndrome, the inner critic, who do you think you are? All of those voices. Now, I actually relate to my inner critic as the voice of my father. Now, I know everyone that I know has an inner critic, but I do believe mostly that inner critic voice or those words came from somewhere. It's not innate in my nature. My soul does not speak to me like that. My soul optimizes and yearns for me fulfilling my potential. So I have to listen quietly to the whispers of my soul and say, why am I here? And even in the face, which is why I speak about resilience, it's not the stoic sort of resilience that we have become accustomed to, like pushing through and picking oneself up and getting over it and pushing on, being that stoic person. That's not what I think is resilience. I think it's resilience like you're speaking to, Lorenz. The resilience is in the face of my own resistance, firstly, and then the opinions of others, of you moving to New York and um, bringing world peace. That is a huge declaration, ongoing and forever. That hasn't got, I'm going to do it by 2050. I didn't hear you say that. So that's why I
Mm,
call it a declarative speech act, because usually our speaking has a time frame to it, which is an old traditional way of working. But we can declare something, be at work on it, like it's an ongoing thing and it may never happen in my lifetime. And I wake up many mornings going, what are you thinking? Who's interested? Let it go. And then one person will ring me and say, oh, wow, that was amazing. And I see it was so important. And let's bring it to the United Nations this year. And I'm like, okay, I'm back on. And that firing in my belly that reconnects me every time to that I stand for. We need others to remind us. You
mm,
remind me, Lorenz. I see your face. You invite me onto this platform, and I'm reminded of who I am.
mm. You know, it's so true what you say because there have been so many times in my life when I've just been done. And that's that one person who's like, I have this vivid memory, and it was actually in 2010. And I was so beat up. This was a totally different startup. And I met this lady at a conference and she asked me what I do. And she's like, you have to do what you're doing. It's so important for the world. So, it was a
Exactly.
totally random lady. She knew nothing about me, but her words just, and that probably gave me the juice I needed to. After that, things only got worse. I spent a year living in my car, but I made it through, and I stayed with it, and in the end did raise money for that particular company. Um, so it's just a testament to the other. That there's one side is your stand that you take, and the other side is how minuscule acts of support can have magnanimous impact. It's really amazing.
Exactly. Can remember one instance like that for me, Lorenz, was we did a hybrid event in a FemQ event during the pandemic in Costa Rica. So we had 390 people online and some people in residence. And one woman walked up to me at the end of the summit and said, Karen, and tearful as she was, she said, I feel safer in the world because you're here. I was like,
Mm,
oof, okay, keep going.
mm,
And I think the other thing for me is my life. I keep talking about as lived experience, Lorenz. And you've asked a question in a social time where you asked a question: if people really knew me, what would they know about me? I think that was
mm.
that's
If you
similar
really
to
knew
the
me,
question.
you would know. Yeah.
That's it.
The prompt.
If
If
you
you really
really
knew
knew
me,
me,
you would know.
you would know exactly. So one of the things is I was a competitive road cyclist. And what I learned, the lessons I learned, I think I should write something about this. The lessons I learned about being a competitive road cyclist in a peloton is phenomenal because I was the minority. Out of 80 men, there were probably 5 women that I used to train with at 5 o'clock every morning in Australia in order to ride in the World Masters, in order to raise money for the African woman food farmers. So there was a lot at stake. And I remember that riding in that bunch when I wasn't strong enough and I lost the momentum by dropping back because I didn't have the power to keep up with the bunch. And a man put his hand in the small of my back and pushed me back onto the pack because you pick up slipstream and you pick up momentum when you're riding in the pack. And I was feeling shameful that I couldn't keep up. And I said, it's okay. I'll meet you at the coffee shop. And it still makes me cry or brings tears to my eyes when the voice said, he pushed me again up onto the pack when I dropped off. And he said, if you don't make it, none of us will.
Mm,
Because he saw the pack as the whole.
mm,
And I was like, wow, if only we lived like that.
mm,
So I think these moments in our lives It's like, how do we put our hand in someone else's back who's not doing so well, or feels like they can't make it, or feels like they haven't got the resilience or the momentum to keep up? And I think that's one of the things I love about you and Natasha as well, is always looking for the pack, always looking for the whole, always looking for bringing people together. I don't think we're going to make it if we don't do that.
Mm.
It's going to be bringing people together and working in the collective. And for me, I bring feminine, or speak about feminine intelligence, because I see as a critical component of bringing wholeness, returning to wholeness.
Mm. There's
But
an
that as lived
interesting
experience. Go on,
there's an
please.
interesting connotation to what you just said about the competition, competitiveness. Our world
Mm,
is so situated in competitiveness, and certainly, we're talking about learning. Much of early childhood learning is highly competitive, and and at the same time, there can be this kind of more healthy competition where you're with a bunch of cyclists that are part of that where the wholeness is still intact. I'd love to have you share some reflections on that, on toxic or versus healthy competitiveness, and how the feminine intelligence weaves with that.
I think that the peloton as a concept is very similar, if you like, to entrainment that we see birds do. So birds fly in a flock, and
Mm,
then one peels back and the next person takes the lead. Or we see it in murmurations where birds are doing this. The swallows do murmuration. And I think these notions that we see in nature, or in the peloton as an example, because it mimics that, is, if you like, for me, a feminine aspect, even though the bulk of the riders, until you get to the end of the ride, when everyone competes to the finish line. So everyone stays together. If you watch the Tour de France, everyone stays together. They all help each other until the last distance, short distance, when then everyone just goes for the competition and to win. So I think this notion of, one, scarcity and competition, and two, collaboration and connection, is, firstly, we're taught most, certainly in the Western world, in the as a child, we play the game musical chairs. I don't know if you ever played that
of
game,
course.
Lorenz. It's like there's scarcity. Go for the chair. So it comes
Mm,
from a very early age of, and women have, I think, my belief is, and witnessed, that women don't help one another often in corporations because there's scarce seats at the table. So if you take my seat, then I don't get there. So there's this notion of competition for the scarcity of resources and scarcity of seats at the table. So it gets perpetuated through the system, this notion of scarcity. And I often say to people, many people in companies I work with will wake up saying, I didn't get enough sleep. They'll take their feet off the floor at the end of the day and say, I didn't get enough done. So this notion of scarcity is pervasive in our, I've got enough, don't have enough money, I don't have enough this or that. And then we have the statistics, 2% of investment is invested in women's enterprises. So scarcity is very strong. The notion of collaboration and cooperation has to be fostered, but it comes from deep trust and care. And it comes from a much more holistic and systemic view of the world, that we are all interconnected. And if you lose, I lose. And that's not how the system's set up. It's if you win, I lose. It's not win-win. How do we both win? How do we both optimize resources, potential? How do we share? How do we be fair? That's not how the system's set up. And so I don't think we are recognizing the demise and the diminishing of our potential when we operate out of this notion of scarcity. And I think that's critical for the transformation we need, is start to look at the optimizing our energy, not just time, because time is a limited resource, energy is not. And so that's what one of the things I've come back to out of doing this retreat in the last week, and being in the beautiful Dolomite Mountains and detoxifying my body, was, when I'm clean and healthy, I'm optimizing my potential. When I'm clean and I'm flourishing. And that's what I feel right now, is getting back in touch with what does it take for us to flourish. So I have an organization that goes into corporates and does my corporate work, which is called the Flourish Initiative, which it takes initiative to flourish. And then the not-for-profit side of the work I do is FemQ, is operationalizing the feminine. That I don't believe you can flourish without the feminine.
Mm. I love that, operationalizing the feminine. I think, as we wrap up here, maybe the last question I'll ask is just because you've been doing business for, I think, over or almost 40 years, um, what's what's the biggest thing that's changed for you in terms of how you operationalize the feminine in the way that you do business today?
I think the momentum for the change, more than any other time, has been the pandemic and COVID. And what I'm seeing is the devastation um, in corporates of what that's produced in terms of mental ill health. But I also think that coming into people's homes through the online communication that we've done during the pandemic has diminished the potential of many people. So I think that for me, right now in corporates, it's more than ever before, it's building community, not team.
Mm.
That's what I would say. And that's what I'm committed to, is being able to help leaders bridge these divides where we feel like we belong, we're not competing, we feel like we're recognized for our unique contribution versus diminished because we're different. And I think that shift in mindset is going to be critical for businesses to flourish, because the younger generation that's coming through just don't tolerate it,
Mm.
which is why we're seeing such a big movement toward the non-binary terms, people wanting to identify or not identify with a gender, because the neutralization of this objectification, separation, and isolation, people are trying to find different approaches to neutralize or harmonize these um, biases and prejudices. So I think that's the big thing, is for me, building community versus team.
Mm. Darren, thank you so much. I really
Mm.
appreciate our time together. It's really such a joy to connect with you. It's such an inspiration to hear your story, and you're doing such amazing work in the world.
Thank you so much, Lorenza, as you and Natasha are. And so thank you so much for having me and being such a support to us. Sutra has been such a support. And in the summit, in my business, thank you so much.